Welcome, everybody. This is one of our presentations for Connections Online 2021, and I'm Merle Robinson, one of your organizers and moderator for this session. I want to point out, as always in our sessions, we want to give our appreciation to our partners at Armchair Dragoons who have helped us organize this event online. And this particular panel is about distributed wargame tools and techniques. And what we plan to do is cover how to establish game controls, communication channels, and player access to essential resources in a couple of different ways. So we're going to show you some examples of programs that do that. Our panelists are going to be Dr. Ed McGrady, and I've shortened everybody's bio here a little bit, so I'll let them add on when we get there. But Ed is a senior fellow for the Center for New American Security. He's a coordinator of the Moore's Wargaming Certificate Program, and he's an author of Roll to Save, Gaming Disease Response. We also have Patrick Dooley with us from Canada, a scientist with the Defense Research and Development Canada Center for Operational Research and Analysis. And we really want to thank Dr. Dooley for joining us. Myself, I'm a retired DoD Analyst, Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, lead designer for the National Security Decision-Making Game, and I'm the Stuckey Outreach Director for Connections Online and Connections USA. Chris Carlson is joining us. He is one of the principals with the Admiralty Group that does tactical naval war games. He's a retired USN officer, naval analyst in technical intelligence, and the author of multiple novels and books, some with Larry Bond. And I'll let him give the exact count because I had trouble finding it as I was looking through things. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move to Dr. Ed McGrady to do his presentation. And here you go.
Okay, well, thank you, Merle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about how I use distributed technology, and I've been using it ever since the pandemic slammed down, to try to do some of the larger scale war games and seminar games that I do. And why is that not advancing? Who am I to talk? I've done more than one of these games. I do about one or two per month. What I'm talking about when I say games is a large scale seminar game, generally about 20 or so people, all of whom are people that do things like run chaos and fight wars and stuff like that. I've done it over multiple platforms. I've even used something called Shindig, which I'll mention, but I've also used Teams, and I tend to prefer Zoom. And so I've done this quite a bit, so I have a little bit of experience with it. Like I say, I do large-scale operational theater and strategic games. I've also done games looking at automotive parts online, as well as climate change, and a few other miscellaneous topics over the course of the last year. And as the coordinator for the Moore's classes, I'm involved in all those classes, and we have games that we run during the classes, and we've done lots and lots of classes so far this year where we have run games. So I've had some experience in doing this sort of thing. And the question is always, what could possibly go wrong? This is obviously a very useful tool, but at the same time, there's challenges. And a lot of times there's fancy systems that you could use, such as Discord. But on the other hand, I have players sometimes who are literally driving across the outback of Australia trying to play the game on their phone. And I'm not kidding about that. And so there's a lot of issues that come up as you're trying to deal with this stuff. Teams is the number one issue, and I'll complain more about Teams later. But there's also simply version control. If you have the wrong version of Zoom, you can't do certain things that you could do with the right version of Zoom. So there's an almost infinite number of technology challenges that come up when you're trying to do this. And my preference is to keep it as simple and straightforward as possible in order to try to avoid a lot of these problems. And inevitably, if you have a power loss, you could have the entire game go down. And likewise, a lot of times what the problem is, it revolves around the players' systems, the players' knowledge, and the players' ability to actually communicate effectively with control. And I'll talk about all those. And so the basic structure of what I'm going to be talking about, I try to break it down into controlling, communicating, and adjudicating, sort of like move, shoot, and communicate. And to start off with controlling, which is essentially trying to keep the game on track, try to move players around, trying to make sure everybody understands what's going on. You really need to be able to move you need to be able to speak, and you need to be able to coordinate. All of the different platforms have challenges with some of these. First of all, you need to be able to understand what is going on as the controller. As the controller for one of these games, you've got people broken up into multiple little rooms where they're planning or doing whatever it is they're going to do. You need to be able to go into those rooms as the controller and find out what they're doing. Oftentimes, and I'll get to this later when I talk about adjudication, oftentimes you want to do that because time is so tight for adjudication. You're actually trying to get ahead of the players on some of the adjudication problems. At minimum, you need to be able to go in and explain things to players. This can be a challenge. Teams is the primary example of where this becomes a challenge because you can only be assigned to one, as I understand it, not an expert on this stuff, as you can only be assigned to one room on teams, and then you can only go back to the main room. You can't jump around between multiple rooms. This is a challenge. Because most of the time what I need to do is run between rooms and coordinate gameplay. In addition, I need to be able to talk to the players and they need to be able to talk to me. In some cases, on some platforms, that can become difficult, and technology doesn't always make it easy. The need to move between cells is really defeated in teams. Teams apparently, as far as I know, and I've used it and I'm about to use it again, you can't easily bot between cells in teams. At least that's my understanding. I need to be able to talk to everybody in the game. And Shindig, which is an interesting system, it's a very expensive system, but what it does is it gives you a podium where you can have speakers, and then you can have little groups and clusters of people kind of wandering around in this two-dimensional space, and they can join and they can have conversations. You can leave a group and go to another group and join them and have a conversation. In that sense, it's very handy. But one of the problems with Shindig that I encountered was you can't talk to the admin guys. The admin guys are in a separate room that you can't move into unless they allow you to move into it. So I can't seamlessly move around the game space in Shindig because of that. And in addition, and as you'll see in a second, I need to be able to share large files. I need to be able to push the picture. Well, the picture in some of these things is both complicated and very large. Zoom does not facilitate picture pushing very easily. And for that reason, I always try to graft on either Slack, which is my preferred one, or Slack is very similar to Discord. And I've also I also like to use Google Docs to push some of these very large files. There's issues with that, and we'll get into those in a second. In addition, there's something called Jamboard, which is a Google product that is not well known. It's an educational product, but I've been usurping Jamboard. Just go to jamboard.google.com. I've been usurping that because that'll put up a shared whiteboard with whoever has the link. And so again, it makes it easy for players to get into because again, players are on their cell phone somewhere out in the outback. And it also makes it easy for me to push pictures and share information across Jamboard. And I've really begun migrating to Jamboard quite a bit for a lot of the stuff that I do. Well, in terms of communicating, I keep talking about pushing the picture. And this is what I mean by pushing the picture. I'm pushing the entire battle space in the air, sea, and undersea domains across the channel, and in the ground domain too if we're playing Europe. And I need a lot of resolution here because we're playing at a fairly granular level. We're playing at the sort of individual ship task force kind of level, and with clusters of aircraft. So I can't push a small picture. One of the things is, well, why don't you make it smaller? Well, to make it smaller, I lose resolution and I can't display all the information I need. The problem with that is, how do I share the picture with the players, not only in a way that allows me to push it to them in terms of bandwidth, but also for them to be able to manipulate it and push it back to me? There is no good way that I found to be able to do that. Sure, I could use something like one of the online wargaming devices that allows people to do that, but then I have to train my players. And I only have my players for a very limited amount of time. And taking a couple hours out to train them when they're then going to not really be able to understand the material anyway is a challenge in and of itself. So my solution is, again, to push across Google Docs and Jamboard a lot of this stuff to allow me to communicate with the players and also to annotate the materials, because a lot of this has to do with me annotating and talking back to the players about what is going on and how the various adjudications and resolutions came about. This is a challenge. The advantage of this, of course, is that you can do double blind, that the other guy doesn't necessarily know where the Chinese player doesn't necessarily know where the US players' things are, and so forth. Another thing we try to do a lot is command and control, to try to look at various aspects of disrupting communications, up and down and so forth, which is very easily done in something like Zoom, where you can simply cut players off. You have, I've done this a lot, you have chat, you have video, and you have audio. And you have the picture, which is what I mean by video. So you have video, the picture, you have audio and video, and you have chat. And I can stop each one of those individually depending on what communications links are up and down. I began by saying, okay, well, let's use a little switchology here and give something like this to the players. But then what we quickly learned as we went along is that running a JFAC is a little more complicated than simply throwing switches. And so particularly for the JFAC, we needed to drill down with spreadsheets and started sharing spreadsheets back and forth to look at sortie allocation and targeting for the thing. So in addition to the pictures that I'm showing up here, I'm also pushing this kind of information back and forth, which again stresses these platforms quite a bit, and it makes it quite difficult for me to actually control a game like this. Not to mention the fact that once the players get a hold of it, they mess it up in any number of ways, which results in me having to try to figure out how to sort it out after they get through tearing it apart. The best way I've found to run these kind of large-scale combat games is over Zoom, using Slack as a way to push the picture back and forth. With Slack, I can have different chat channels, again, for the communications piece too. I can have different Slack channels to allow players to communicate, for me to communicate the picture with players, for the players to push their moves back, and then the face-to-face discussions all take place on Zoom. You can obviously duplicate this with Discord, though I'm not familiar enough with Discord to know how it handles large, 30 megabyte size files. In addition to this kind of work, I've also done work on a more fancy picture. We actually did this in Zoom with presentations. We played a war game with 500 people participating as part of a seminar. This required a very different approach from something like this, because 500 people aren't going to be filling out a ATO. Instead, what we did is we gave them very simple choices that were clearly presented to them. So red would present their choices, blue would present their choices. People would vote using the voting function. And then once the choice was made by the players, I would quickly adjudicate on the map and show them and talk them through what the outcomes were. But that's another example of using this kind of platform in a way that we have never used it before, in the sense of trying to do one of these games for a very large audience, which more or less worked. Finally, I gave up in trying to push stuff back and forth to the players, and I focused on Jamboard. This is a screen capture of one of my Jamboard sessions, where the players just tell me what they're going to do, especially for a strategic game like this one, which was a relatively strategic game. They tell me what their actions are, I adjudicate them, and I push them back out over Jamboard, which works pretty well. Now, adjudication is a major issue. You would think that the advantage of this medium is the fact that you have the ability to do double blind. But the minute you go to double blind, that really increases your adjudication problems. And obligatory slide of Pete Pellegrino. The double blind is an advantage, but the problem with adjudication is that now I've got to take what all these players have done, try to reconcile it, merge it together, sort it out, figure out what they are trying to do, because again, they're not necessarily going to be doing exactly what I want them to do in terms of annotation, and then give it back to them pretty quickly. And one of the problems I've encountered is that sharing the picture, no matter how you share it over these different platforms, doesn't necessarily come back to you the same way you put it out. So the players use a different version of PowerPoint. Google Docs a lot of times messes things up if you try to edit in Google Docs, and so it can really rearrange the picture for you. There's a couple solutions I found to adjudication in this rather rapid double blind kind of environment, one of which is just go with the flow. Do what you can in real time, read it back to the players. This was the game where we did the 500 players in an audience kind of thing. I'm going to have to go with the flow. I can't take a pause in that game and do my adjudication. I'm going to be doing inline real-time adjudication. The other option is what I do with a lot of the larger games where we only have like 20 or 30 players. The players go off and get a snack for half an hour. I get the wonderful job of trying to reconcile the pictures, try to figure out where the interactions are, try to adjudicate the interactions, all in a situation where, as I keep saying, what the players are trying to do may not be terribly clear. One of the advantages is, though, with something like Zoom, I can always go back and talk to the players and see what they were trying to do and read their moves back to them so that I can have a pretty clear picture of what they're doing. Unfortunately, that adds time to the overall adjudication process, which, again, sort of delays and slows down how much you can get done in the game. The other thing that I began doing recently is watching what the players are doing and try to get stuff done early. If I absolutely know they're going to conduct a strike against the aircraft carrier with a specific set of capabilities, I can adjudicate that ahead of time, and I don't have to go in and do that as part of the game, part of the actual pause for the adjudication phase. I just did that, for example, in a domestic information operations and elections game where I would go in and I would kind of get an idea of what the players' actions were going to be. I would try to get those adjudications done ahead of time, and it allowed me to cut my adjudication time down by about a factor of 2 or 3, which was really helpful. So there are tricks that you can do to try to work around some of these things. I know everybody's going to say, well, why don't we do it in something like Vassal? And again, my problem is I've got players that are barely capable of running PowerPoint in a lot of cases over online, much less trying to do something like Vassal. So, and furthermore, I can't annotate it. So that's been my experience. I tend to prefer Zoom plus Slack because I need to move big files, I need to have chats with people, and I also need to interact and move around a lot. Teams especially has been very crippling, and some of the other platforms that we use like Shindig is interesting and it's very unusual, but it's not something that would be a great advantage over Zoom and Slack. And I think Jamboard has a lot of applications in this situation. So that's my presentation. Hope it helped. And I'll turn it back over to Merle, or I'll answer any questions that people have.
Looks like we had a couple of questions, Ed. One was, what adjudication tools are in use and how visible are they to the players?
I explain my adjudications, but I don't necessarily have a particular tool I use. I have my own for something like those large scale naval games. I have my own shot ratios and number of missiles to kill and that sort of stuff that I use. And I mostly walk the players through, okay, this happened, this is what the outcome was.
Okay, we've got a second one, which is this just a heuristic thing that's handled by the great and powerful Oz behind the curtain, or is there a set of spreadsheets or calculations that you're using behind the scenes?
There are spreadsheets and calculations for things that are amenable to spreadsheets and calculations. So if you want to attack an aircraft carrier, I have the number of missile hits that you need to take out the aircraft carrier, just like anybody else. Likewise, if you're doing ground combat, I have a ground combat resolution that's based on the wonderful CWAM, which I find to be the sort of the best heuristic for ground combat that's out there. And that's available on PACSIMs, remarkably enough. So that's great. And then on the other hand, if they want to do some shenanigans like trying to blow up every bridge in Western Europe, then I have to do the great and powerful Oz thing. We have to estimate. And the way I do that, frankly, if you're interested in adjudication, the way I do that is I try to break it down into easy, hard, and medium, and then modify it from there, very much like a matrix game type technique.
So another question is, how do you respond to the out-of-the-box left field moves by players in this kind of situation?
Those are. It depends on what you mean by out-of-the-box left field moves. If they're trying to do a shenanigan, which generally involves special forces, then I'll try to assess the overall, I mean, I treat it seriously. I try to assess the situation. I try to assess the pluses and minuses of their being successful in doing that. And that usually relates to the context. And then I try to assign hard, medium, or easy, because a lot of times we don't have values for this. Just take soft blowing up a bridge, right? Is the bridge defended? Are the soft already in place? Do the guys that own the bridge already have it wired to blow? Which is really awkward when you come up and try to blow it yourself. So there's a lot of different variables that you have to take into account for some of these things. And so I try to walk through that process, that if the enemy has applied a couple of reserve battalions for rear area security, then you're going to have a much harder time blowing the bridge than if they have not done that. And it's simply going up against, the regular, infiltrate, set up the target and engage it. So a primary example of a left field, not a left field move, because they do it all the time, is they want to drop the span that runs from Denmark to Norway over the Baltic, right? And my assessment is that's not an easy task. That's a big bridge that you're trying to blow up. What exactly are you trying to blow that up with? And they're going to have security, and so it's a hard thing that you're trying to do. And so I don't give them a lot of ability in a couple of days just to drop that bridge. So that would be an example of a shenanigan that you have to deal with.
So another question was, could you tell us why you chose Zoom for the game that you showed, and the advantage you thought it had over other things, and whether you think about switching to other things?
Okay, the advantage of Zoom is I can do what I want to do, which is move, shoot, and communicate. I can move around in Zoom. I can communicate with people in Zoom, and it's a pretty rock solid platform. Also, most people have Zoom. They need to have the most recent version of Zoom so the players can actually move between rooms. That's a really important thing to have. As far as I know, again, I'm not behind the scenes technology. I'm just relating what I've been told. And so if the players all have the most recent version of Zoom, it's pretty seamless, and most people have used Zoom. So it doesn't have the problems that Teams has, which mostly involve moving around. It also is not expensive. Everybody has it and everybody's familiar with it, so I don't have to train people on it. The big disadvantage that Zoom has is the chat sucks. The chat in Zoom is not really helpful. It goes away if you move between rooms, and so forth. And so if they only would fix the chat, Zoom would be the ideal platform. But my attitude is we can substitute either Discord or Slack for the chat in Zoom, and then it pretty much all works out.
So another question was, do you ever require or enforce basic standards for hardware and software in your games?
Not hardware and software so much, but we do try to enforce standards on Zoom. And like I just said, I want all the players, my requirement now is to push out everybody who participates needs to have the most recent version of Zoom. Because again, you'll get some person running on a Windows XP machine from northern Alaska that has Zoom 1.0 and can't do anything. And you don't want to have to deal with that on the day of the game.
Okay, well, I think that those are all the critical questions. There are a couple we'll have you answer in the text stream later. But what I want to do now is move on to Patrick Dooley. So I'm going to bring Patrick in. And this is Dr. Patrick Dooley from Canada. And here's his presentation. Thank you so much, Patrick.
Hey, thank you very much. So my organization, DRDC Cora, helps Canada's military and others make better decisions. And one of the ways it does that is through gaming. So our gaming team called SAGE has developed during the pandemic era an approach we call EDGE that helps us select tools and apply them in order to meet game requirements. So today I'll tell you a bit about some tools and techniques used by SAGE to do that. So up top there, you have a definition of collaborate. So by that definition, it follows that every multiplayer game is a collaboration. So tools that we develop to collaborate in business should be able to facilitate gaming. And that's true whether it's in a distributed manner or even in person. So I'll break what I mean by business collaboration tools up into these three categories. So video conferencing platforms like we're using right now, text-based communication tools, we've just heard about Slack, and document creation or editing suites, so for creating text documents, spreadsheets, slide decks. And these sorts of products can be standalone, internet-based, or cloud-based. And today I'll talk about examples of using all three of these types of collaboration tools for gaming. So if to game is to collaborate, then to collaborate is to communicate. So I'll outline two of our techniques for in-game communications. The first being a more conventional example using parallel video conferencing with structured text messaging, and then a somewhat less conventional one for automated in-game communications using linked cloud-based spreadsheets. So first example, using video conferencing and structured text messaging in parallel. So we all know the benefits of video conferencing. It's verbal, so it's fast. We have video, so we have nonverbal cues. And the platforms tend to be easy to use. We can have public video conferences, break out into private discussions, and so forth. The drawbacks are that generally one can only be in one video conference at a time, and that our video conferences, the discussion is unstructured. There's no history to the discussions to refer to, and so on. The benefits of structured text messaging are really complementary. So we can have more than one discussion at a time. We can assign topics or themes to those discussions. We can have both public and private discussions, and there's a persistent history to which we can refer back. The downside is that they require typing, so they're slower, and some of the platforms can have a steeper learning curve. So our approach when we're designing and implementing games is to really think about the types of discussions that need to happen in that game, and then to prioritize them. So the most important or demanding discussions, we're going to use video conferencing to have, in our case, usually Cisco WebEx meetings. And then all the other discussions that go on in parallel with that, the secondary discussions, we're going to use structured text, generally in our case, Slack. So when we're selecting our tools, we're really seeking a gaming environment that's well-controlled, low-risk, efficient, and reusable. So that means that tools like Slack that we can pre-configure are better because we can create, pre-populate, test those workspaces, beforehand and fix them. And second, we have pre-configurable and redistributable accounts. So people don't just show up to a game with, clicking a link or whatever. We issue them an account that we've pre-configured, distributed to them ahead of time, and that's how they come in. So we create a very controlled gaming environment. So for video conferencing, we're having our primary discussions. Generally, we have a plenary video conference like we're having right now. Everybody's present, the team's shown in chromatic colors. And then there's a control team shown in gray, where you have a facilitator who's out front, keeping things moving. You have a technician who's behind the scenes operating the tools. And then we have a support team who are doing multiple things like providing secondary technical support to participants. They're providing information about the game, how it's played. They're collecting data for analysis later. And they're also generating situational awareness for the whole team. So we all have a sense of what's going on. At points during a game, you're probably going to want to have private discussions. So you've got breakout sessions where, in this case, we're showing internal discussions within a team, and they're accompanied by a member of support staff who's doing all the things that I just mentioned in plenary phase. So in addition to those internal discussions, the breakout sessions, we also create other breakout sessions for bilateral discussions, trilateral discussions between teams, and those are created on an ad hoc basis by the technician upon request. So that's how we do our video conferencing. Now, in parallel with that, at the very same time, we have multiple text-based channels, structured text-based channels for all those secondary discussions. So we're using Slack generally. We have a collection of public channels and private ones. So for instance, there's a plenary public channel that everyone's a member of, can discuss the game. But we also have those private channels for internal teams discussions, bilateral, trilateral private discussions. We add an administration private channel for members of the control team to discuss things with one another, as well as multiple public channels like a help desk where people can ask for help, a testing channel where they can get to learn to use the platform, a file repository, and so forth. So here's an implementation of the game ISIS Crisis in Slack. This is a player's perspective. So you can see we have the internal Iraq channel. So this is from the point of view of a player on Team Iraq. And anything they're typing in this thread is going only to members of their team. You can see up here the padlock or other private channels. Team Iraq also has private bilateral discussion channels to all the other factions in the game. Add to that a public help desk, a public plenary, and so forth. And again, because we're creating the workspaces before, Slack is very pre-configurable, and we're pre-configuring the accounts before that we issue to players, then this is actually a very well-controlled, well-tested game environment before the players even arrive. Okay, second example. We'll call this one consolidating human inputs and providing subsequent notifications secretly after adjudication via linked spreadsheet automation, or for short, well, let's just call it chips and salsa. So chips and salsa is an automation technique. So why do we want to add automation to a game? Well, for starters, automation can make a game viable that would be unplayable by hand. So for instance, in our game Fish, if we were to do all the dice rolling and all the rule checking manually, it would take hours to do and the game would be unplayable. Whereas we do all that processing in an automated way, so it only takes seconds and is really transparent. That sort of speed up means that with automation, you can implement more sophisticated or more realistic rule sets, have as many dice rolls as you want, and you get fewer errors in your adjudication. And all of this leads to faster play and thereby greater player engagement in the game. So the way that Chips and Salsa does this, it achieves this automation using linked spreadsheets. So spreadsheets first. Why would one want to use a spreadsheet? Doesn't sound very fun. Well, they're ubiquitous, they're powerful, and they're flexible. Everyone either already has a spreadsheet tool or can get one online or download one at effectively no cost. The virtual dice and the calculators they offer are fully customizable, and they have both built-in spreadsheet functions and embedded scripting or programming languages where you can implement and adjudicate even very complex rule sets. Their ability to adjudicate very quickly is at the thousands of calculations per second level. And if you don't like the look of a spreadsheet tool in your game, you can adjust the graphical user face so it doesn't even look like a spreadsheet. And importantly, spreadsheets also offer someone a rapid prototyping capability. So you can think of something to try, implement it very quickly in a spreadsheet, and test it. If it works, great, you keep it, maybe improve it. If it doesn't, you throw it out and rapidly build something else in another spreadsheet to see if that works better. So the examples I'll show you today are built in both Google Sheets and Microsoft Excel. So linking spreadsheets together. So the three boxes here represent spreadsheets. The green one at the center is a master spreadsheet controlled by the control team. And the blue spreadsheets on either side are player specific. So one for player A, one for player B. We use either predefined spreadsheet functions or scripts that we write ourselves to link those spreadsheets together and enable the passage of data from the control team to the players back and forth. So during a game, the control team's master spreadsheet is receiving inputs from each player and then adjudicating them and providing outputs back to each player. And those data linkages, the flow of information back and forth between players and the control team through these linked spreadsheets can be automatic, whereas that adjudication is happening as soon as data is entered or changed on the sending spreadsheet, or it can be semi-automatic, where the adjudication happens on a set schedule or after either a player or a controller pushes a button. It's whatever your game design requires. These linked spreadsheets can be run on a private LAN, on a corporate intranet, or they can be cloud-based. And if you're using cloud-based linked spreadsheets, you have the ability to exchange data in near real time. It's very fast. So, consolidating human inputs. So during a game, players provide inputs of various kinds. For instance, they may submit moves, they may cast votes, they may make bids, depends on your game design. Because we have a hub and spoke network of spreadsheets where they're all directly connected to the master spreadsheet, the master spreadsheet naturally consolidates all of these inputs for adjudication. After adjudication, we can just turn those data flows the other way around. So after adjudication, each player can be notified of things like the outcomes of their moves, the outcomes of polls and auctions, changes to their units and resources, or we can update players' situational awareness. And we can pass unique notifications to players, so they're player specific, or if we want to have a global announcement, we just post the same information to all players on their various links at the same time. Secrecy. So in our hub and spoke arrangement, the master spreadsheet is directly linked to each player's spreadsheet. So the information that we transfer back and forth is inherently private, but we can also still broadcast publicly, again, by posting the same information to all players at the same time. as required. So adjudication said the reason that you want to use a spreadsheet is it can calculate really fast. And that adjudication can be fully automated, whereas data comes in or inputs come in, the adjudication just happens, or it can be semi-automated, where a controller is waiting for a certain condition to happen, maybe a sanity check, maybe for all players to provide something before they start the adjudication process by pushing a button or something. These master spreadsheets also allow real-time monitoring of players, or a master spreadsheet can act as an intermediary where it collects inputs from players and then passes that data to other tools, either to adjudicate them or to visualize them. So I'll show you quickly 3 spreadsheet-based tools with which we implement Chips and Salsa, namely Bugs, Smelt, and Catfish. So Bugs stands for balloting using Google Sheets. It's a secret voting tool. Every player has their own player-specific spreadsheet. That spreadsheet has tabs. Each tab corresponds to a turn, and that tab is effectively a ballot for that turn. So there are 5 teams listed here in the game, and the player will vote. He will or she will provide an estimate of the likelihood that the action proposed by, say, the healthcare system will succeed, and how likely will the business sector's action be to succeed, and so on. Very simple, 5 votes. So if we call that player A casting their votes, in parallel at the same time, all the other players in the game are casting their votes in parallel, so it's very fast. And as these votes are being cast in real time, they're being moved to the master spreadsheet that the control team is watching. So here's a look at that master spreadsheet operated by the control team. Again, various tabs, they're all turn-based. And in gray, you see where the votes will come in from the players. As that is happening, the sheet is automatically calculating the median probability of these, so the central value. The controller, when they're satisfied that the votes are in, all they need to do is tick a box, virtual dice are rolled, and then the tool decides by comparing the dice roll to the median probability whether an action succeeds or fails, and the players are notified. So here's a very simple way to pass information, or to pass information and do secret voting efficiently using linked spreadsheets. But we can do other things. Here's a very different example. We have a game called Fish that involves a zone-based map, this one. And the game involves seagoing units that are based in a particular zone, and players can choose which other zones they want to deploy them in to do things. So I'll talk to you a bit about how we do our unit deployment. So again, every team or player has their own team-specific spreadsheet. In this case, we're looking at Team Canada. That spreadsheet has a tab corresponding with turn, so it's turn 1, first tab. And before the game, the control team allocates units to Team Canada, where Team Canada's units are based, and then the Canadian player deploys them using drop-down menus denoted by these red triangles, selects from a list where he wants that unit to operate and what he wants it to do there. As he's doing that, if he's player C, all the other players are simultaneously deploying their units, and their moves are being passed in real time to a master smelt spreadsheet controlled by the control team. When a controller's looking at this and all the moves are in, they simply take a single cut and paste to copy all of that move data at once into another spreadsheet called Catfish, which is where the adjudication happens. So Catfish is doing all kinds of calculations. It's doing things like calculating the shortest route for every unit between where that unit was based and where the player wants it to go. It's doing detection calculations for every unit. What does that unit see? And is that unit seen by others? And finally, it's taking all those results and doing language calculations where the results are formed into sentences, and those sentences form detection reports that are passed back to the players. So all of this adjudication in Catfish is happening in a second or two, and with a single cut and paste, the controller can move that information back to the master smelt spreadsheet for automatic distribution to players. So one last thing. Up till now, I've talked about a single master spreadsheet, but I've just shown you 2 master spreadsheets, one for Smelt and one for Catfish. Why are there 2? This is an example of our rapid prototyping. So before we played Fish for the first time, we realized we really need to automate this adjudication. So we built Catfish to do that. We did our first play test, said, wow, that adjudication worked well, but the move submission and detection reporting is too slow. It needs to be automated. So we built Smelt, did a second play test, worked really well. So now we can look ahead and say, maybe we can make an evolved tool for fish that does all the functions of both of these tools and combine them into one. So with that, I'll sum up, talk to you about business collaboration tools, 3 kinds, how we can use them for in-game communication, both in a conventional sense by using video conferencing and structured text messaging in parallel, and automatically using link spreadsheet automation.
Patrick, that's really great. Thank you so much. So we have some questions. One of the questions was, any reasons to prefer Slack over Discord? I'm sorry. Yeah.
2 reasons. One, I think Slack is a bit easier to use for starters. So because when you have all these people coming in, you're going to get the whole spectrum of players or participants, right? So you need to try to keep it as simple as possible. And the second thing is, when you're working in a big organization, as some of us are, those organizations, look differently at different tools, and Slack was something that we can use in our organization, so it's a natural one to use in that case.
Okay, the second one we had was how many players did you have in this game? How many channels for all the functions, and how long was your setup time?
So for a game like Fish, we've played Fish with 14 players, 5 controllers, and a few observers. So you're talking about 20 people. The players in Fish, they're probably seeing about 10 channels, basically like ISIS Crisis, but just with a couple more, plus any ad hoc ones. So if someone wants a trilateral discussion, I will create that, and they will have a dedicated channel just for that. So it's really not too bad, too overwhelming at that level. The setup time, what we try to do is we try to make things reconfigurable. So we create a workspace, we create channels, and we're just renaming channels, renaming accounts, and redistributing them. So the first time that you set something up, so to create a Slack workspace for a game, maybe it takes a day. To configure the accounts might take another day, Slack and WebEx. And then to replay it, it takes you a fraction of a day to clean up that workspace, reset it to clean up those accounts. So you're talking maybe half a day. So the time really goes into creating the game materials, creating the processes that you use with the game. But the actual setup of the workspaces isn't too onerous. Okay,
another question we had was, as for your dice roll, you mentioned that you had a random number generator. To roll those dice, what do you actually do? Are you using online dice or some other mechanism?
So Bugs is implemented in Google Sheets, and Google Sheets has a scripting language called AppScript, and it's like a little bitty programming language, and you just program a dice roll in there, and you link the dice roll to the little tick box. So if one has a look at AppScript in Google Sheets or VBA in Excel, you're just creating a little short routine that is triggered by clicking that box. So it's nothing special. It's standard Google Sheets, what comes with Google Sheets.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. I think that's all the questions, but we'll check the chat later to be sure that we've answered everything. And now I'll move on to my segment. And let's see, we'll do this. Look at this. So there we go. All right. So this segment is going to be a little bit more of a deep dive. This is my group's experience with Discord in trying to run a online Cuban Missile Crisis game. Traditionally, we run large, unstructured games at hobby conventions and academic events with up to like 147 people. And this is one of our more structured academic games that we've done. We've run this over a dozen times, plus at a couple academic venues, including WinSec down at Fort Benning. Basically, this particular exercise is designed to simulate the experience of crisis decision-making and put the players under the constraints and challenges of the era so that they get an insight and awareness about the kind of circumstances, choices, and individuals. So this is sort of a timed action, live action role play where there are national teams for the three big actors of the United States, the USSR, and Cuba. Leaders curate decisions, so they're all group decisions that are made in these sessions. Participants basically try to channel and role play historic personages, and we put in historic and plausible counterfactual events, things that we know might have been poorly reported or were potential possible events, so that the players, even if they've studied the history, don't automatically know how it's going to play out. We also spent a lot of effort in simulating the communication limits and distortion of the era, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, and the limited, unclear intelligence that they have. And at the very end, we do an after-action discussion with the players. Now, the structure of this game is important to understand the other pieces that are coming. You've got three cells, the US, USSR, and Cuba. In the Cuban cell, you also have their on-site Soviet advisors. The guy that's the local general there in Cuba, the missile commander, and so on. Basically in Discord, and all of you have some familiarity because we're using Discord for this convention, you have message traffic channels that are all for text that go outbound and inbound. Now, during the era, some of the key issues to keep in mind was the primary method for communication, particularly secure diplomatic communication, was via telex across transatlantic cables. So they were doing what in the old days were called Twixes, which were short messages. Generally, each particular message would be less than a page. And unless you were doing something direct by radio or TV, there was no sense of immediacy to a message arriving. In fact, when you take into account the cycles involved and the number of processes where you'd write a message, it would go to somebody that would put that message in the proper format, it would be encrypted, it would be sent across the cable, it would be unencrypted, it might be, then would be read, it might be translated if there was something specific that had to be conveyed to the foreign government in their language, and then it would be considered. So the cycle time in this period often was a minimum of 12 hours for messages to go from one country to another. So what we basically did in the process is we used the text channels in Discord to control that in and out flow, and we provided avenues for them to send to each of the major players plus the rest of the world in the news channels. We also provided staff channel chats for us to manage things, and we had a gray cell that did adjudication on any actions the teams took, and we had a Milcon controller that handled the maps. Now, a couple of key issues that we discovered in this process was essentially going online took a lot more staff. You know, we could normally run this game live with 3 to 4 facilitators. We needed 7 because you've got to have tech support and some additional communication stuff. But I'll hit that a little bit more. Now, the nice thing about Discord is it gives you lots of control. So you can bring people into your Discord server with no permissions except to see one folder, and they can get an introductory note. And they can be handled through a triage process, so you can assign them in your game to specific named roles. So unless your players know one another by voice or specifically are allowed or get away with informing one another of who they are outside of the game or inside of the game, they don't know who one another is, which has a real advantage when you run this in some academic environments and in hobby environments. Oh, one too many. The other thing we found that was very useful is you can build a master server. So we did this incrementally, and we ran 4 iterations last fall. We built one that was a test base. Then we did a 1-cell game, a 2-cell game, a 3-cell game, and built up to that final. So what we discovered is you can build a master server where you build all of those roles and check channels, and you can copy it from one instance of the game to the other. The thing you can't replicate is some of the contents in the folders, because that becomes important when you talk about player resources and the kinds of things you want to distribute. I'll cover that in a minute. But basically, you also have each instance of your server. So you can have a server for your first game and called Game 1, server for your second game called Game 2, and so on. Those can be populated by what the players do and retained for record, which gives you data for an after-action report. It means you need fewer game recorders in a professional event. Makes it shareable after the event, both by the players and the staff. Basically, the way things are structured we're structured is newcomers get that preset limited roles. Then you can give them roles with set lines of permission. So you can have a set of permissions that says they have access to a group of folders. And additional roles can be assigned through the game, and roles can be color-coded. As you notice on our Discord server here, your administrators' names are in one color, the panelists' names are in another. Same kind of thing can be done in that game. And you want to have rigid name control so that whatever role you're dealing with, everybody knows who it is. What's really interesting about that is you can build your groups and roles to match your design. And with pre-approved discussion areas, you can set up private chat channels, just like we did on our server here for connections, where you can have named locations like city names or something else where people can have private chat. It's really very useful because you can tie down the accessibility of information to your players. So in this game, what we did is we had an established setup. So if you see on the right side of the screen, you can see we had folders for player aids and intel and so on. And we had the roles down at the bottom for the different players that were trying to channel these historic personages. So essentially, every player would get something like this. In a US cell, they'd get the player aids for that group. They'd get their specific role, in this case, Curtis LeMay, and they'd get an overall crisis briefing of the things they know leading up to the event. So you can give private and group access to public folders, and they can provide general or specific briefing materials. And that allowed us to put things in like Google links to Google folders that were set up in advance with just the information for those players. Now, that gives you some challenges as you try to use this structured environment in building your game. One is there's an issue with player training. You know, we're going through that to a certain degree here at Connections because you're all trying to learn how to use Discord if you aren't already familiar with it. So there's navigation and resource locations and things like that you have to tell people. There's a manual in some cases, and you have to have tech support. At the very least, you have to have one staffer that's always watching to help people that run into trouble. And one of the things we found with staffing is, in addition to the tech support, you have to have extra people to monitor all these separate communication channels. The ones that are important for your game, whether you're trying to measure pace or get a sense of the direction of a particular team's decision-making, or to see if there's something broken where somebody's playing outside of role and you need to choose whether or not to intervene, you have to have people that can move amongst those groups. And sometimes that's a spotty process because if you've gotten, like in our example, we had 7 facilitators, 2 or 3 people that are moving from location to location. So we had a cell-specific facilitator that stays there all the time. We had a military controller that stays there on the time. We had a central core gray team that were basically focused on adjudication. So you've got to have all of those roles filled to even handle something this small. This particular game was designed that you'd have 7 to 13 players per cell and a total of about 39. And it became a real challenge. The other thing that you have to do with a game like this is you have to monitor activity in team communications, as I mentioned, but you have to watch out for dropouts and struggling players. If you run a public event, you can look across the halls and bounce from meeting room to meeting room and see who's in a corner not interacting with anybody, and you know when to intervene for that. It's very hard to see in the online environment. The other kind of quirky things we ran up with is a person that has multiple roles gets the most permissive role, and that sometimes created issues because we'd have staffers that were supposed to have particular functions and they'd accidentally put something into another area. You also have the everyone role where you can send out messages to everybody in the game. And one of the other key things is restricted naming. It's to ensure that you had a mechanism for them to know precisely who they were dealing with. So when you start looking at whether or not you want to use Discord, here's the kinds of things we saw. The basic Discord server is free. It has worldwide reach because you can have a game that crosses time zones and you can attract more people than you would in a physical event in, say, New York City or Tokyo or wherever. It also bypasses all the pandemic and travel limits. People with low budgets can do stuff in a Discord-based game. And it allows you to individually and customizingly control each participant. Lets you handle simultaneous use of voice and text channels. And you can use video, but video is not particularly reliable in the free version. So you'd have to upscale for that. It also allows your players to be anonymous to one another in terms of what their real life role is. So if you've got a 4-star in the game and you've got a Butterbar's lieutenant in the game, they don't have to know who's who. It also is really great for helping you with record keeping. Anything that's done in text, you've got a record of. So sometimes you'll want to take a verbal discussion that you heard and put it in a text channel. And if it's not public, you may want to have staff channels where they can record that kind of thing. So you may still need a professional recorder for a large game, but you may not need it in all cases. Now, why would you not use Discord? Well, one of the issues is the learning curve and whether your players understand it. The other thing is every step takes more preparation. In our experience, online games add 10 to 15% to your prep and 10 to 15% friction to what the players do because it doesn't have the same ambiance and multi-levels of communication that you have when you can see people's body language and hear their inference and their inflection. Group dialogues become really hard. We found that even in this sort of turn-based game that we ran, getting groups of more than 7 in Discord to come to an effective decision in the time that they had was very difficult because the voice channel basically handles one voice at a time and people sometimes would talk over one another. So it's important to have side channels for video and chat where they can break out into 2s or 3s and then come back to the main group with the things that they had to work on independently. The other thing I point out again is that the free video bandwidth's not reliable, so you'd have to upscale that for professional game. The other things that we had in terms of practical lessons were this. You have that increased emphasis on preparation. You have to do feature testing. You have to have player aids. You have to have player tool training and figure out what level you need of each one of those. You have to limit discussion group sizes and create multiple channels so they can have breakout groups. And it's best for small player cells, even though you can have a large number of cells that operate in sort of a fixed manner. This would be very good for the hobbyists that do mega games. And if you want to hear more about mega games, you can come to our presentation on Friday. It's also more suitable for turn-based games and things with written submissions. It let you maximize written player communications. And like I said, you still need recorders for verbal communication. Now, a couple other things I want to add to this are, just as Patrick talked about how they link spreadsheets and automatic tools to do things like die rolls and adjudication, this lends itself to that if you have those automated tools behind the scenes, because anything you can link to, you can make available to individual players or to the staff to use electronically. And that's another real advantage of Discord. Come on now. Oh, that's my last slide, so yes. So now we can move to questions. Let me bounce over here to Discord. Help me out here. Help me out here, Gary. Is there anything you've spotted, or are we at the end of questions? Not seeing any questions, so we will move from my presentation to Chris Carlson. Welcome, Chris.
Hello. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. What I'm going to talk about is a specific application in an educational game that Larry Bond and I ran with several Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps units. And in particular, one of the things that we did is that we went to not only a distributed approach because of the pandemic, but also the fact that this was fundamentally an educational game, so the players had to have time to process the information and get back to us. So throughout March, Larry and I ran a remote game dealing with a Persian Gulf scenario for the University of Minnesota, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and George Washington University. These are all NROTC units, and we had about a total of 25 to 28 midshipmen throughout this entire event. The tools that we used we tried to focus completely on keeping this as simple as possible. Since this is an educational game rather than a collaborative or exploratory game, following the KISS principle is really something you need to do, particularly when two of the units had no previous experience with wargaming. So we used Microsoft Excel to take in unit orders. They could tell us what they wanted to do with their systems. We used Excel because everybody's got it from a university perspective. It's fairly easy to use. I could set up a pre-formatted form and they could just type in it. And if they needed more space, they just either clicked down one or made the cell bigger. So we didn't have a huge learning curve on getting us orders for their aircraft or their ships. Feedback was done predominantly through Zoom, again, because the universities all are using this. So we had a very straightforward approach for those folks because they've been doing this for the last year. To get away from some of the version control problems that we had in an earlier rendition, there was a coordinating school, in this case, University of Minnesota. They would send out a Zoom link so that we could go through browser if necessary. This gave us an option to have two routes to be able to talk. And the other feedback was done through a application that one of our game designers has come up with. Kevin Martell has Simplot 2. And what this allowed us to do was to keep track of where everything was and also provide the feedback in display forms that they would recognize from a U.S. Navy CIC display. We used the Harpoon 5 basic rule set with some modifications. And the first thing I'll say is Harpoon 5 is not simple. It's a very complex game. To a large degree, Larry and I don't shirk away from that because naval warfare in the modern era is complex. And if you're going to learn about it, you need to embrace it with all its nastiness. So what we did is we walked the players through their platforms. We went through in detail what kind of sensors they had, what kind of weapons they had. And same thing for their aircraft, and explained the various parts. But what we didn't go into was the mechanics. That was something we kept opaque. Larry and I did that for adjudication. We were using 30-minute turns, although we would often scoop down to 1 minute to walk things through. And we gave the players 2 days between moves. Again, this is an educational game. We want them to take the concepts they're learning in their naval science courses and apply them. And if you don't have someone who's really big on wargaming, and none of the three units really were, you got to give them time to talk to each other. So we gave them 2 days. We met on Tuesdays and Friday, and we ran one turn each time. The U.S. Forces was a 3-ship LCS-1 type surface action group with aviation assets. And the opposing forces were Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, WPTGs, which are patrol boats with missiles, and WPBs. Those are just standard, those are those little fast boats. The nice thing about having such distances in terms of turns, 2 days, is that adjudication wasn't a problem. It was done semi-automatic, if you will. We had spreadsheets set up that had every possible combination of weapons and target with a final probability of hit, and we just used random number generator to give us what came out of it, and then that was folded back in. So when we fed back to the players, we used screenshots from Simplot, and we used email. Because, again, this is an educational game, you got to keep it simple. You have to have limited objectives. So we were trying to get the midshipmen to focus on tactical decision-making and to gain an appreciation for what the U.S. Navy has. Therefore, we focused on anti-surface warfare with an emphasis on scouting and targeting. Just a quick overview, the U.S. had 3 LCS Freedom-class ships. One had a Naval Strike Missile anti-surface warfare module. Another had the Hellfire VLS module. And a third had the ASW module, which means for this particular scenario, it was almost damn nigh useless. But since the Navy wants to factor in numerous types of mission profiles into a group of LCSs, you're not going to have a homogeneous group. They had 2 LCSs with MH-60R Seahawks, and one was running around with 3 MQ-8B Fire Scout UAVs. The Iranians were all operating inside the Persian Gulf, so it's all IRGCN assets. There were 6 Thondars involved. These are Chinese-made Type 021 Hudongs with Noor or Gadir type missiles, which are basically knockoffs of the C-802. There was also 2 PACAP 3s and 2 PACAP 2s. These are North Korean-based patrol boats, again running around with Chinese missiles. On top of that, we had a whole bunch of these little small guys that running around with basically not a whole lot of firepower. They had a 107 millimeter multiple rocket launchers, which if you're moving real fast, look great, do almost nothing. Their other weapons were Chinese or Russian based 50 caliber machine guns. This was the initial setup that we gave all the units. Basically, each unit ran their own surface action group, and we gave feedback on all 3. And you can see here I've got all the patrol boat, the high-speed boats are in a nice big arc with your missile shooters pretty much all behind. I had took the liberty of having some of my missile shooters riding in close proximity to a merchant ship to confuse the Americans. And then the LCS group all started down below there, you see to the left. For game flow, the units submitted orders via Excel. Again, it's simple. Everybody's got it. If I had any problems with the orders, it went straight back to the individual unit by email. They were also encouraged to come up with standing orders just in case you had to cover something that the Iranians might do, because I basically ran the Iranians as a random number generator, depending upon what the Americans had done to them first. Simplot 2 was used to execute movement and detection because I can put it on range rings for various sensors. And you can then go in and click boxes that would then show to the blue side what they had seen. If they had not visually identified it, it was shown up as an unknown target. They also had courses in speed if they've been tracking it. And we would then take several screen captures of various sizes to provide situational awareness back to the teams during feedback. All combat was resolved with Harpoon 5 rules. Again, we didn't go into detail with them with that, but we did provide them a copy of the spreadsheet we were using so they could get an appreciation if they wanted to. And Zoom sessions were held on Tuesday and Friday, where we would go over each unit's move and give them the results with greater detail rather than just the Simplot captures and the emails. It also provided an opportunity for the midshipmen to start asking questions. By the 3rd turn, we were starting to get some good questions. They were starting to click. We did 5 turns over the course of 3 weeks, and after that, we did a hot wash-up with a final question and answer session. This is the example of the University of Minnesota's 5th move. So you can kind of see specifically what we've got here. It shows them the location of their helicopters. And then you can see unknown platforms here and over here. These are merchant ships largely. And then you can see they've identified these Iranian units so they know what they were. One of the things that we wanted to point out were the interesting learning points, the things we wanted to stress. The fast patrol boats on the Iranian side pretty much got wiped out by the all 3 units, and that's largely because of the Hellfire missile, particularly the VLS module that we put on one of the LCSs. It was very effective, partly because it's a good missile. The other side is the Iranians had absolutely no defenses. Those fast patrol boats had no countermeasures, and when your only hard kill option is a manually aimed and fired 50 caliber machine gun, your life expectancy is not particularly long. Against the missile shooters, the U.S. forces had a significant advantage. The Iranians, while they had missiles in the Noor, which has up to 100 nautical miles range, the problem is these guys couldn't see past radar horizon. They've got long-range missiles, but no targeting system. And what UAVs they had, they didn't have real-time data links. Everything went back to Bashir, so it had to be relayed out, and that meant time late. The US MH-60Rs have Link 16, so they were providing targetable data immediately, and you had a real-time data link with the UAVs. So the US was using the Naval Strike Missile at over-the-horizon ranges, while the Iranians had to get within the horizon. There was a great appreciation for the effective layered anti-ship cruise missile defenses. All three LCSs had a Mark 49 ram launcher, and a 2-missile ram salvo has a pretty good chance against a subsonic, transonic anti-ship cruise missile. The LCSs also had chaff, and that really did help them in quite a bit. However, the Iranians were still able to saturate their defenses because they're not that robust. The LCS does not have a huge defensive window for it. And all three units had saturation attacks come in, and all three units had at least one LCS be hit. One unit had an LCS that got hit by 2 Noors, and that one was in a real bad state of affairs. Another thing that the students found out very quickly, and we talked about this at length because some of them are reporting to an LCS, is that a single anti-ship cruise missile can render a modern warship mission killed or worse. Of the 2 units, 2 LCSs had a CIC critical hit that completely took it out of the picture. So what we found is that all units quickly learned that if you want to engage, you need to go scout ahead and not just charge where you think the enemy is. 2 units basically turned east and ran at flank speed. Not recommended. They quickly got on that using their aviation assets to find and localize the Iranian targets was crucial, and it became something that you had to do if you were going to fire effectively first, as Captain Hughes put it, and not just firing first. Game flow was a bit cumbersome at first because 2 units were completely new to the concept of wargaming. And as Merle has pointed out, remote gaming raised the bar a bit in terms of additional work and friction. One of the reasons that we really liked the time frame between the moves is because of the limitations of Zoom and or Discord in terms of discussion. And so that's why we put 2 days between turns to give the students a chance to talk amongst themselves. And if there was some real questions, to talk with the unit staff who has warfare qualified lieutenants on it. Feedback, the communicating part was adequate. We got the information through, but it was clearly not the strong point of the game. It was where we had problems the most. Multiple screenshots at various scales of the Simplot 2 display worked pretty well, but just knowing where the guy was after 30 minutes is a whole lot less than watching him move and getting that feel for the kinetics, if you will. Because of the Zoom sessions provided limited opportunities for discussing amongst groups the complex issues, we did use it for specifically question and answer. So we would get one person to describe something or ask a question, and then another person would answer. We're thinking maybe in the future to looking to Discord to set up channels so there can be some chatting between units. But at this point, we really didn't see it as a necessity to make this particular game work. All in all, Larry and I felt pretty good about it. There are some things we need to do to hone it up a bit, but from the midshipmen's perspective, they walked away feeling pretty good about the whole event and that they saw a lot more than what they were just seeing in their lectures. And that's it.
Okay, so we have one question so far. After the training scenario, were you tempted to up tempo and real-time scenario that could add command pressure?
There's really no way you can do real time in a sequence, particularly with 3 different units of varying levels of experience. They felt pressed as it was. I often got orders just at the stroke of when they were supposed to come in. So they felt pressed enough as it was. And since I'm trying to get them to think about tactical decision making, adding additional pressure probably would not have been in their best interest.
So what was the difference between watching a move and receiving a post-move update?
If you watch the movement on the Simplot, because you can break it down to as fine as, I think, 5 seconds, you get to see where the guy is going, what he's trying to do. With a screen capture, you have to take the last turn and the current turn and try and figure out what his track was. That's not as good, if you will, from lending information to the players. One of the advantages, and to some degree disadvantages, of miniatures games is you see everything. A lot more information than you have a right to. But it's very helpful in an educational game to be able to see the process as it's working. Just giving them screenshots every 30 minutes was problematic, but it did work.
Okay, so I believe that's the last of our questions. And if I can get Ed to turn his camera back on, we'll come back for any final comments from the group. And there's Ed. Cool. Any final thoughts, Ed?
No, I was just actually curious if Chris used Harpoon to generate the lookup tables he was using for the missile hits.
Yes, I did.
Oh.
Did you expect anything else? He's done a lot of work. So I'll ask my other question to Chris. Chris, help me out. How many books have you written? Because I struggled to find you separate in the searches.
I've written 8 novels with Larry, and I did a book on the 1936 naval wargaming rules with John Curry over in the UK. We've got in the works a Tactical Problems 3 and 4 from the 1936 rules, which is a War Plan Orange and a War Plan Red scenario. Not that I want to have Patrick get worried that we really are coming up to take Halifax away from him. That's not what we're intending to do here.
That's good. So the other follow-up to that is, which one of your books are you most proud of?
Oh, geez. From an author perspective or a wargaming perspective?
Either perspective.
I'd have to say that Shattered Trident is my favorite. It was a unique way of doing a war of someone against China without it being the U.S., because the problem with big power wars is they tend to go to liquid sunshine distribution in the end.
And then I know somebody here. Who could it be? Oh, Ed, you've got a book that you should be telling people about.
Yes. I have a book on, of all things, disease response gaming. It's called Roll to Save. It goes into a lot of the technical, one of the reviewers described it as very technical. It does go into a lot of the technical details and procedural details on dealing with designing and creating games for disease response, to include pandemics, but not just pandemics.
So, Patrick, I'm going to demonstrate my ignorance. I don't know any articles or books you've written, but if you want to make a plug, please do.
I won't plug anything. I'll offer a thought, though. So the discussion about dice and everything, I mean, one thing I'd say is that, the die is 5,000 years old, right? And when we're playing a game, we really want to think about why we're playing a game. If it's recreational, throw dice, it's fun, it's tactile. But if we're playing a serious game, right, we really want to streamline that, reduce the burden on people, right? So I would never, ever use dice if I'm already using a spreadsheet or something. And I think we should think again about technology. It's not really about just distributed usages. We're talking about distributed usages, but there are big advantages to taking these same sort of linkages and things, putting them in the same room, so that if two teams at different tables are communicating in the same room, nobody else in that room knows, right? So all of these things are directly transferable to in person to really put the focus on what matters, as opposed to mechanical things we do to adjudicate.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. So we're going to close a little bit early, but I'll ask our panelists to double check the Discord channel for questions and see if there's anything that they want to answer in text form after the session. And thank everybody for joining us. And I want to thank our panelists again. It's great to see you all and to have the opportunity to work with you. Catch y'all later. Thank you. We're going to end the broadcast.
Thanks, Merle.
Thank you.